In the 20s, the 1920s, Chicago was a city that broke all the rules. Those rules were formed by one man and one man only, Alphonse Capone, known as Al Capone or Scarface. Al Capone ruled over an empire that was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His grip on the city was formed by his outrageous generosity and his incredible violence. He bribed and paid off anybody who was in a position to help him, and murdered anyone who stood in his way. Capone was born in January the 17th, 1899. He was a first-generation immigrant. Al Capone's parents left Naples, a city in the south of Italy, in 1893, looking for a better life, as did millions of Italians. Italian emigration was fueled by dire poverty. Life in southern Italy, including the islands of Sicily and Sardinia, offered landless peasants little more than hardship, exploitation, and violence. Even the soil was poor, yielding little, while malnutrition and disease were widespread. His parents moved to the United States before he was born and found their first home in the Navy District of Brooklyn. Life was very hard there. Fortunately for Al, when he was 10 years old, his parents had established themselves in the United States well enough to be able to afford to move to a better neighborhood. His parents were good-natured people, very respectable. His father was a very well-known barber. But Al Capone was different from his parents in this way. He always joined local gangs, stole things, and got into fights. But even from a young age, Al aspired to be more than a street punk, always trying to impress the neighborhood and make himself out to be some kind of hero, a person to be looked up to. One day, an elderly woman in the neighborhood got her washboard stolen by another group of kids. So Al got together a gang of children from his neighborhood. They confronted the other juveniles and beat them up and took the washboard back. He then paraded himself through the neighborhood as a hero, as some kind of a Robin Hood character. Capone was smart. He got good marks at school, but he always had violent tendencies. And this led to an incident in the 6th grade at school where he smacked the teacher and in return got thrown out of school. He learned more on the street than he did when he attended school. Capone tried the straight life. He took on various jobs, including being a cloth cutter in a book bindery, a pin setter in a bowling alley, and he also worked in a munitions factory. Capone would work through the day and give much of his money to his parents to help them look after his siblings. On the night time, however, he took up a job as a bouncer in a bar called the Harvard Inn. This bar was owned by a gangster called Frankie Yale. And it is through Frankie Yale that he got his first taste and experience of being involved in the mob. Capone enjoyed his job as a bouncer because it allowed him to hone his skills as a fighter. He also liked the ladies, but could sometimes be a little brash. One night, a man called Frank Galluccio was in the Harvard Inn bar with his sister. While Frank Galluccio was attending some business, Al Capone walked over to Frank's sister and said to her, "Honey, I mean this as a compliment. You have a beautiful ass." Hearing this, Frank Galluccio took out his knife and scarred Al on the left side of his face. This is what led to the nickname Scarface. Frank Galluccio felt justified in scarring Al Capone because Al was just a lowly bouncer at the time. What fascinates many people about Al Capone is that he never sought revenge for the scars, even when he became so powerful in Chicago. Many suggest that this was because Al Capone had a deep respect for family values and knew that he was in the wrong for talking to Frank's sister in such a way. Al Capone recognized that he would have done exactly the same if someone had spoken to one of his sisters like that. Frank Galluccio must have later found out about Al Capone's rise to power in Chicago years later, and must have feared revenge from a man who had so much wealth and muscle behind him. Al tried to explain the scars to other people and said that they were the result of a war injury. It was also at the Harvard Inn that Al caught the eye of a gangster called Johnny Torrio. Johnny Torrio was impressed with young Al, his willingness to listen and to learn. So he became Al's role model. Eventually, Johnny Torrio got offered a job working for Big Jim Colosimo, who was the underworld boss of Chicago. It was too big a position to turn down, so Johnny Torrio moved to Chicago and took Al with him. Big Jim Colosimo's empire included gambling joints, brothels, and he also owned a nightclub. His nightclub was the hottest joint in Chicago and was frequented by gangsters, millionaires, and also politicians. On December the 30th, 1918, Al Capone married an Irish girl called May Josephine Coughlin, and she gave birth to his son, Albert Francis Capone. Things were good for Al Capone. He was making decent money. But it wasn't until the Prohibition Law was passed in January 1920 that the opportunity opened for Al Capone. Johnny Torrio instantly understood that prohibition was the opportunity of a lifetime, as it opened up a tax-free business. A business in which they could supply alcohol and no one else in the city could. However, Big Jim Colosimo did not want to get involved with the illegal distribution of alcohol, as he felt it would bring too much heat down on his already well-established empire. He saw it as a gamble, and therefore told Johnny Torrio and Al Capone that they were not to be involved in that particular business. So Big Jim Colosimo had to go. Torrio passed the job to Al Capone, and he made sure that Jim Colosimo was no longer their boss. Recognizing that they needed an outsider to pull off the job, so that if anything went wrong, it could not fall back on them, Al hired his ex-boss, Frankie Yale, to do the hit. And Big Jim Colosimo was shot dead in his own nightclub. Even at that early age, Capone was grooming himself to be the boss of Chicago. He even attended night classes to improve his accent. He wanted to be a man who could be presented as a respectable businessman. He spent a lot of money on his clothes, and also, eventually, after attending the night classes, spoke with a more respectable accent. He was one of the sharpest dressers in town. Because of his sharp dressing, he even got a nickname that he liked, Snorky, which means sharp dresser. Al was delighted by this, because it was a step away from his original nickname, which he hated, which was that of Scarface. With his sharp dress sense and his now respectable accent, Al would frequent the nightclubs of Chicago and present himself as an honorable man, always generous and always courteous. This was a deliberate strategy to try and deflect any other reputation that he had away. If he appeared to be a gentleman, then people would be less likely to believe that he was the monster that people spoke of. Presenting a positive public image had already become one of his top priorities, as he understood that presenting such a character would allow him to evade suspicion with the law, and also make it easier for politicians and other people of power to help him later on. However, sadness was just around the corner. In 1920, Al's father passed away. So Al took on the responsibility of his family and brought them all to live with him in Chicago. He and his family lived in a 15-bedroom house on the south side of Chicago. He brought his brothers into his business and looked after his mother and all of his sisters. To them, he was a gentle father figure. They found it hard to believe he was the man that everybody knows him as today. But despite being the perfect family man, Al Capone had vices of his own. He was often found incredibly drunk in clubs, and used to also sleep with the prostitutes who worked in the brothels that he ran. This would eventually be his downfall, as it is from these prostitutes that he contracted syphilis, which had a terrible toll on him in later life. Al continued to work under Johnny Torrio, learning of him every day. At this point in time, there were many gangs supplying Chicago with alcohol, but Johnny Torrio stepped up with a plan so that there would be no more destructive wars between the gangs. He suggested that they join forces and work together to beat the law enforcement. With a united front, the criminal underworld's supply of alcohol became a very slick operation. It became so that they supplied every single joint in the city with alcohol. Some refused to buy their alcohol, preferring to buy it from somewhere else, possibly because it was cheaper, or possibly because it was better quality, or maybe even because they were making their own. However, it would be explained to the owners of such establishments that they simply had to buy their alcohol from Al Capone and Johnny Torrio. And if they refused, terrible things would happen. Their bar may be set on fire, they may be beaten up, or they may even be killed. With the growth of the alcohol distribution business, they were even able to have specific jobs for specific people, division of labor, and in this, slowly but surely, began to run the business as a corporation. This in turn made it even more sophisticated and efficient, and allowed the business to grow and grow. But with the size of the business, it was obviously going to attract the attention of the city's law enforcement. There was only one way around this, and that was bribery. Al Capone spent millions on bribery every year to keep people in power turning the other way. But by now the business was turning over around 150 million a year. So this was small change to keep the business running. It has been estimated that around 60% of Chicago's police force worked for Al Capone. A staggering figure. However, it was the case that this was quite common in American cities at the time. Widespread police corruption was prevalent throughout the United States. Al Capone had successfully kept himself under the radar. However, in 1922, he had a car accident which involved a taxi driver who was badly hurt. Al was drunk. When the policeman turned up, he arrested Al, but Al Capone just told the police officer it made no difference to him, as he would fix it, meaning that he would get off with the arrest. Al did get off with the arrest, and this was reported in the papers, and this was the beginning of Al Capone as a legendary public figure. Notoriety can be a good thing, but for a gangster, it is always better to be under the radar, as it attracts less attention from the police force. By this age, at the age of 23, Al had become a legend in the city. and had become complete partners with Johnny Torrio. However, one problem which lay ahead was that the peace that Johnny Torrio had instigated between the criminal gangs in Chicago was beginning to fall apart, and as it did, a war erupted which led to the death of so many gangsters. This was not good for business, as it brought down heat on the business. This was known as the infamous Beer Wars. The ferocity of these wars led to Al Capone not only being in the Chicago papers, but now being featured heavily in the national papers. This was not good for business, as he had now come to the attention of the American government. With the Beer War almost over, Johnny Torrio decided to take a break and went on a 4-month cruise. This led Al to take over the entire city, as he was unchallenged at the top. Al became the godfather of Chicago. With Chicago now completely wrapped up under his control, Al was still not satisfied, so he began to expand his empire into the suburbs. The first suburb that he took over was the town of Cicero. He was able to bribe all of the town's officials, and they in turn allowed him to open up bars and gambling joints. Gambling had become a very large part of Al Capone's business. By owning gambling joints and fixing races, he was able to offer massive and very attractive returns on some bets, knowing that he would not have to pay out as the race had been fixed. It was also a great way to bribe officials. If officials were caught with massive sums of money, they could end up being charged and convicted, which would be bad for them, but also bad for Al Capone, because once they had been discredited or convicted, they would lose their position, which would mean they could no longer be of any help to Al Capone. By giving them a rock-solid bet, they would receive money, but they would have a legitimate way of explaining how they came about such a large sum of money. It was from the Hawthorne Inn in the suburbs that he began to run his criminal empire. He even rigged the Cicero town elections so that he could keep those who were helpful to him in power. He did this through beatings and also murder. It became obvious to anybody else who wanted to run for power in Cicero that if they were to try and take control of the town, a terrible fate would befall them. This led to the leaders of Cicero becoming unchallenged, which meant, in turn, that Al Capone could do whatever he wanted in that town. Everything was going fantastic for Al Capone. However, sadness was just around the corner. His brother, Frank Capone, was shot dead during a fight with the police. With his complete control of Chicago and the suburbs, Al came to the attention of the newspapers of the city. Wanting to control how he appeared in front of the public, he knew that he could not go around killing journalists, because if he did, they could write anything they wanted about him. He could not treat them as he had general people. So instead, he began to buy out the newspapers, and that way he could control the stories that were released about him, and even tell them to print things that he wanted printed about himself, and in doing so, present himself to the world as a respectable businessman. A few years later, Al's accountant was beaten up by a local bootlegger. This was a personal matter to Al Capone, so Al Capone personally found the man and shot him in the head 6 times. The police discovered who it was because there were 3 witnesses. And because of that, Al went into hiding. However, realizing that he could not stay hidden forever, he eventually turned himself in to the police. However, Al got away with this murder for 2 reasons. Number 1, the witnesses, realizing who he actually was, changed their statements. And also because no one would agree to be on the jury for a case against Al Capone. This sent a message to Al Capone that he was now untouchable in terms of the law. No one would witness against him, and no jury would possibly dare to find him guilty. He was simply untouchable. In 1925, Johnny Torrio was convicted under the Prohibition Order and sent to prison. And in March 1925, having been shot some 3 months earlier by a rival gang, he decided to announce his retirement. It was no surprise to the underworld of Chicago that Al succeeded him and became the boss of all bosses in Chicago. Capone continued to be featured in the local newspapers, and it became the case that barely a person in Chicago did not know who he was. However, there were always rivals wanting to take over his criminal empire, and as such, and also with the attack on Johnny Torrio, he decided that he had to take more special measures in protection. He built a car that was armor-plated and also had bulletproof glass. It was more like a tank than a car, and the back window could be flipped downwards in an instant, just in case they needed to fire out the back window at a car that is following them. Some would say that this is paranoia. However, in Al's eyes, he was simply just taking precautions, always trying to stay 1 step ahead of anybody who might try to assassinate him. In 1925, gang violence went through the roof, with bodies being found on the streets almost every day. Suddenly, Al had many gangs to take control away from. They were trying to rival him for his business, and Al, even at the young age of 26, was not going to allow this to happen. So murder was the only way to keep control. In 1928, Al Capone bought a 14-room mansion in Florida for £40,000. This was a place where he and the family could get away from the hustle and bustle of Chicago. Was he already looking at an end game? Possibly, but what was going on in Chicago would not allow him to slip away very often. Loyalty was everything to Al Capone. So in 1928, he was devastated to find out that his long-time friend, Frankie Yale, had been stealing some of his booze shipments. Devastated by this news, and also incredibly angry, Al Capone sent 6 gunmen to New York to wipe him out, and Yale was killed on the 1st of July, 1928. Al Capone still had one major adversary, Bugs Moran. George Bugs Moran was born to French immigrants on the 12th of August, 1893. He lived in the city of St. Paul, Minnesota. At age 19, he moved to Chicago and almost instantly got involved in street gangs. Like Capone and Johnny Torrio, he came to prominence with the Prohibition Act and became the head of a gang called the North Side Gang. When Capone killed Moran's friend, Charles Dion O'Bannon, Moran swore revenge, and the trouble started between the two men. Bugs Moran had caused him all kinds of problems in terms of the supply of alcohol in Chicago City. It was now time for Bugs Moran to die. On February the 14th, 1929, men dressed as police officers went to Moran's warehouse, where they were expecting a shipment of whiskey. The police officers told them to face the wall. So Bugs Moran's men did so because they thought it was a typical raid. As soon as they faced the wall, they were mowed down with machine guns. This became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The finger was pointed at Al Capone, but he had an airtight alibi. He was in Florida, attending a meeting with the district attorney. On May the 16th, 1929, Al was arrested when he left a movie theater. He was found to be carrying firearms and was given a year in jail. He tried everything to bribe his way out of it, but nothing worked. But this did not hinder Al Capone. He simply ran his gang from prison using the telephone. Because of the publicity that followed Al Capone, the federal government began to get involved in trying to put him behind bars. All of his gang were sent to jail on income tax fraud charges. This massively weakened Al Capone's network. Desperate to improve his public image, Al Capone opened the first Chicago soup kitchen, which was vitally important in terms of his public appearance, because the Great Depression had started to kick in, and many people were starving on the streets of Chicago. By feeding them, he became a hero to many on the streets. In 1929, the Prohibition Bureau of the Justice Department in Chicago appointed a new boss, Elliot Ness. Elliot Ness was an uncorruptible man who lived with high principles. He began raiding Al Capone's network of warehouses where he stashed his alcohol. This caused a major problem for Al Capone. Suddenly, the cost of producing alcohol and getting it distributed to bars around the city became much more expensive because so much of it was lost, and they had to take bigger precautions to transport it safely to the necessary places. The IRS were also hot on the tail of Al Capone, and having discovered various ledger books which detailed the transactions and payments to Al Capone, they were able to bring 25 counts of income tax evasion dating from 1925 to 1929. The IRS calculated that Al Capone owed the American government $215,000. A small amount compared to the amount of tax that he would have evaded during those years. But it was substantial enough to be able to bring him to court on hefty charges. Knowing that these were serious charges that he could possibly be convicted of, Al Capone tried to enter a plea bargain, but this was turned down. So then he tried to get to the jury and bribe them. So the authorities switched the jury moments before the trial began. With the jury switched, Al Capone did not have time to find out who the jury were and have time to get to them and bribe them. For the first time ever, he was facing court without a jury that had been bribed or threatened. Capone was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to 11 years in jail. Still to this day, it is the largest sentence ever handed to an individual for income tax evasion. Al Capone appealed the sentence, but his appeal was turned down, so he was transferred to federal prison in Atlanta. In August 1934, he was transferred to Alcatraz, otherwise known as The Rock. In 1936, a fellow inmate tried to kill Al Capone by stabbing him in the back with a pair of scissors. However, in 1936, Al Capone was diagnosed with having syphilis. It had already started to affect his brain and was making him incredibly docile. In November 1939, Al was transferred to hospital because of his dire need for medical treatment. Al Capone was eventually released from the hospital in March 1940 and was allowed to make his way back to his home in Florida, where syphilis would eat away at his brain for the rest of his life, making him more and more docile. It is said that by the time that he died, he had the mental abilities of a 12-year-old. At his home in Florida, at the age of 48, on January the 5th, 1947, Al Capone died of a cardiac arrest. His body was transferred back to Chicago for his funeral. It was a lavish and very large affair, with gangsters turning up from all parts of the country to pay their respects to a man who at one point was the most famous gangster in the world. His legacy still hangs over the city of Chicago and is cemented in the folklore of the city. Probably the most famous gangster of all time. He has become a legend and also, in some ways, a myth. But whatever you feel about Alphonse Capone, there is no doubt that his story rings through the ages in the folklore of gangster history.